You think the Vikings conquered half of Europe with axes and swords, charging into battle like berserkers screaming for Valhalla. That's what Hollywood wants you to believe. That's what most people picture when they hear Viking warfare. Some massive guy with a horned helmet swinging a battle axe like he's chopping wood. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. The weapon that actually made Vikings the terror of medieval Europe wasn't some legendary sword or mythical hammer. It wasn't even something they carried into battle on their backs. It was their ships. Yeah, you heard that right. The longship wasn't just transportation. It was the ultimate weapon of psychological warfare that could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. It's like having a stealth bomber that could also carry a full invasion force, travel through rivers barely 3 feet deep, and disappear into the fog before anyone knew what hit them. While the rest of Europe was building massive, slow warships that needed deep harbors and favorable winds, Vikings were perfecting a vessel so revolutionary that it gave them a 300-year military advantage. A weapon so terrifying that coastal settlements across Europe would post lookouts scanning the horizon, not for armies marching across land, but for the distinctive silhouette of a dragon-headed prow cutting through the waves. And once you understand how these ships actually worked, you'll realize why no medieval army could stop them, and why the Viking Age lasted as long as it did. Ships back then were basically floating fortresses. Think massive, deep-hulled vessels that needed crews of dozens just to get moving, required specific wind conditions to sail anywhere useful, and could only dock at established ports with deep water. The Mediterranean galley tradition dominated European naval thinking. If you wanted to move troops by water, you built something that looked like a Roman trireme. These traditional warships made sense for established naval powers. The Byzantines had their dromons, impressive vessels loaded with Greek fire and heavy armor. The Carolingian Empire tried building massive river barges for defense. Even the Anglo-Saxons constructed substantial warships for coastal defense. Bad choice. All of these conventional approaches shared the same fatal flaw: predictability. A Byzantine droman approaching your coast gave you hours of advance warning. Those deep hulls meant they had to approach through known channels, giving defenders time to organize, call for reinforcements, or simply evacuate with their valuables. The Vikings watched this naval arms race from their fjords and decided to go in completely the opposite direction. While everyone else was building bigger, heavier, more fortified ships, Scandinavian shipwrights were perfecting something that would make size irrelevant. The archaeological evidence from ship burials at Gokstad and Oseberg tells us exactly what they were thinking. These weren't just burial goods. They were functional warships preserved in perfect condition, showing us engineering details that wouldn't be fully understood by historians until the 1990s. The Gokstad ship, dating to around 890 AD, is 76 feet long but draws only 3 feet of water when fully loaded. 3 feet. That meant it could sail up rivers that no other ocean-going vessel could even attempt, appear in harbors that seemed impossible to reach, and beach itself on any sandy shore without needing a dock. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These ships could be carried. The saga of Olaf Haraldsson describes Viking crews literally carrying their ships overland between river systems, something that sounds impossible until you realize that a 30-man longship weighs about the same as a modern city bus. With the entire crew working together, they could portage their vessel across surprisingly long distances, effectively giving them access to river networks that weren't even connected. Picture this. You're a Frankish monastery treasurer in 845 AD, sitting safely beside a river 60 miles inland from the coast. Ocean raiders can't possibly reach you. There are shallow rapids between your location and navigable water. Then one morning, you hear the horn calls that mean Viking longships are beaching right outside your walls. That's not just military strategy, that's psychological warfare on a scale that medieval Europe had never experienced. But here's where Vikings got creative with something that would revolutionize naval warfare forever. The problem was fundamental. How do you build a ship that's simultaneously seaworthy enough to cross the North Atlantic and shallow enough to sail up any river in Europe? Traditional shipbuilding said this was impossible. Deep hulls were necessary for ocean stability, but they prevented river navigation. Early Scandinavian attempts at solving this involved compromise designs that weren't particularly good at anything. Archaeological evidence from 7th century ship remains shows vessels that were basically enlarged rowing boats. Better than nothing, but not the game-changing weapon that would dominate Europe. The breakthrough came when Viking shipwrights discovered something that modern naval architects call dynamic stability. Instead of building ships that were inherently stable like floating logs, they created vessels that became stable through motion. Here's the simple science. A longship's hull is essentially a shallow, flexible banana shape. When it's sitting still, it's actually quite tippy. You can rock it dramatically just by shifting weight. But the moment it starts moving through water, the hull design creates a dynamic equilibrium that makes it incredibly seaworthy. The flexibility was crucial. While other ships fought against ocean swells, longships bent with them. The overlapping planks, called clinker construction, were actually sewn together with rope in the earliest versions, allowing the entire hull to flex like a wooden basket. When a large wave hit, the ship would literally bend over it instead of fighting through it. And the weird part is, modern racing sailboats use this exact same principle. Those sleek hulls that slice through America's cup races aren't stable when stationary either. They depend on speed and dynamic forces for stability, just like Viking longships did 1,000 years ago. But the Vikings took this concept one step further with their steering system. Instead of a central rudder that required deep water to function, they mounted a steering oar on the starboard side. Literally, steerboard. That's where the term comes from. This side-mounted rudder could be raised or lowered depending on water depth, allowing the same ship to navigate open ocean and shallow streams. The limitations were significant though. Longships couldn't carry heavy cargo like traditional merchant vessels. They couldn't mount the siege equipment that would be useful for attacking fortified positions. And they required a crew-to-passenger ratio that made them expensive to operate. Then there's something even more surprising about how they solved the speed problem. But here's where Vikings got creative with what might be the most ingenious part of their naval technology. The standard approach to ship propulsion involved either pure sailing or pure rowing. Mediterranean galleys used banks of oars for reliable speed, but couldn't sail efficiently. Northern European sailing ships could cover long distances with favorable winds, but were helpless when becalmed. Vikings needed both speed and reliability, because their entire strategy depended on surprise attacks. A raiding fleet that got stuck waiting for favorable winds would lose the element of surprise that made their tactics effective. The problem seemed impossible. Sails and oars interfered with each other. Traditional galley designs put oarsmen below deck to make room for sails above, but this created ships that were terrible at both sailing and rowing. The Viking solution was characteristically direct. They integrated both systems into a single design that could switch between modes instantly. The key insight was crew positioning. Instead of dedicating some men to rowing and others to sailing, every warrior on a longship was also an oarsman. The ship had oar ports that could be sealed when sailing and opened when rowing power was needed. The mast was designed to be lowered quickly, lying flat in a specially designed crutch along the ship's center line. Here's the simple science behind why this worked. A longship with 30 oarsmen could generate about 15 horsepower, enough to maintain 5 to 6 knots in calm water. When the wind picked up, they could raise the sail and increase speed to 8 to 12 knots while giving the crew a rest. When approaching a target, they could lower the mast in minutes and switch to oars for silent approach and precise maneuvering. And the weird part is, this hybrid propulsion system wouldn't be matched by other naval powers for centuries. Even modern naval vessels struggled with this concept. World War II PT boats used a similar philosophy of switching between high speed and stealth modes, but with far more complex mechanical systems. But Vikings pushed this hybrid concept into areas that seem almost supernatural when you understand the engineering involved. The archaeological evidence shows that some longships were built with removable bow and stern sections. When approaching a target that might require quick retreat, crews could actually reconfigure their ship's length, removing sections to increase maneuverability in tight spaces. The flexibility extended to the crew as well. Unlike other naval traditions where sailors were sailors and warriors were warriors, Every person on a Viking longship was cross-trained. They could row, sail, navigate, fight, repair the ship, and carry it overland if necessary. This wasn't just military efficiency, it was a complete reimagining of what naval warfare could be. Then there's something even more surprising about their navigation system. But here's where Vikings got creative with solving the problem that had stumped every other maritime culture. How do you navigate across open ocean without any landmarks? Mediterranean sailing relied on coastal navigation, staying within sight of land and following well-known routes between established ports. This worked fine in the enclosed Mediterranean Sea, but it made long-distance exploration impossible. The Vikings were facing a completely different challenge. To reach the British Isles from Norway, they had to cross hundreds of miles of open North Sea. To reach Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, they needed navigation techniques that could work far beyond sight of any land. Early attempts at solving this involved following migrating birds, watching ocean swells, and other traditional seafaring techniques. These methods worked sometimes, but they weren't reliable enough for the kind of precise navigation that Viking raids required. The breakthrough came when Viking navigators developed what modern archaeologists call the solar compass system, a navigation technique so sophisticated that its full workings weren't understood by historians until the 1960s. Here's the simple science. The sun's position changes predictably throughout the day and throughout the year. If you know exactly what time it is and exactly what day of the year it is, you can use the sun's position to determine your direction with remarkable accuracy. The problem was measuring time and date accurately, while at sea for weeks at a time. Viking navigators solved this with a combination of tools that worked together like a medieval GPS system. The sun compass was a wooden disc with gnomon, a vertical pointer, that cast shadows marking both time and direction. But the really clever part was the crystal they used with it. Chunks of calcite or other birefringent minerals that could locate the sun's position even through heavy clouds. And the weird part is, these sunstones work by polarizing light in ways that weren't scientifically understood until the 20th century. Viking navigators discovered through trial and error that certain crystals would show the sun's direction even when it was completely hidden by clouds or fog. But they didn't stop there. Viking navigators also used detailed mental maps of ocean swells, watercolor, floating debris, bird behavior, and even the taste of seawater to determine their position. Master navigators could reportedly identify their location within a few miles after weeks at sea with no sight of land. The training required for this level of navigation skill was extraordinary. Young Vikings spent years learning to read dozens of natural signs, memorizing the positions of stars throughout the year, and developing the ability to dead reckon across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Then there's something even more surprising about how they use these skills for psychological warfare. But here's where Vikings got creative with what might be their most terrifying tactical innovation. The standard approach to naval raids involved assembling a large fleet, sailing directly to your target, and attacking with overwhelming force. This strategy worked fine against fortified positions that couldn't retreat, but it gave defenders plenty of warning to prepare or evacuate. Vikings realized that their navigation and ship design advantages could be leveraged for something much more psychologically devastating: simultaneous multi-target raids that seemed impossible to coordinate. The problem was communication. How do you coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles of coastline without modern communications? How do you ensure that multiple raiding parties hit their targets at exactly the right moment for maximum strategic effect? The Viking solution involved using their superior navigation to conduct what military historians now recognize as the first recorded examples of coordinated special operations. Here's how it worked. A master navigator would plan simultaneous raids on multiple targets, calculating precise routes and timing for each ship. The different longships would separate at sea, approach their individual targets along different routes, and attack at predetermined times based on celestial navigation. The simple science behind this coordination system was astronomical timing. Viking navigators could predict the position of stars and the sun with enough accuracy to synchronize attacks across vast distances. using the sky as a natural clock visible to all participants. And the weird part is, this coordination technique wouldn't be matched by conventional military forces until the development of radio communications in the 20th century. The Vikings were conducting coordinated multi-target raids 800 years before European armies figured out how to coordinate battles across a single valley. The psychological impact was devastating. Coastal settlements would receive reports of Viking raids at multiple locations simultaneously, making it impossible to predict where the next attack might come from. The apparent ability of Vikings to strike anywhere at any time created a climate of fear that was often more effective than the actual raids themselves. But the most sophisticated technique involved using their ships' shallow draft for what modern military strategists would recognize as vertical envelopment, attacking from directions that the enemy assumed were impossible. Then there's something even more surprising about how they combined all these innovations into their most effective psychological weapon. When traditional naval raids weren't cutting it anymore, Vikings developed techniques that pushed their longship technology to limits that seem almost impossible today. The first advanced technique involved what archaeologists call ship jumping, using the shallow draft of longships to cross land barriers that should have been impassable. The saga of Harald Hardrada describes his forces literally sailing their ships across narrow peninsulas, dragging them over land on log rollers to appear in bodies of water that had no connection to the sea. Picture this. You're defending a lake settlement that's completely surrounded by land, connected to the ocean by a river that's blocked by waterfalls. Impossible for ships to reach, right? Then Viking longships come sliding down the hillside on wooden rollers, launching into your lake with full crews ready for battle. The second technique involved coordinated river penetration. Instead of just sailing up one river, Viking fleets would divide into smaller units and simultaneously penetrate multiple river systems, creating a web of raiders throughout an entire region. The Frankish chronicles describe this happening along the Seine, Loire, and Rhine rivers simultaneously, with Viking ships appearing hundreds of miles inland almost overnight. The third advanced technique was seasonal base swapping. Vikings would establish temporary fortified bases on islands or river mouths, then use these bases to launch secondary raids throughout an entire campaigning season. But here's the clever part. They would rotate these bases, abandoning old ones and establishing new ones faster than local defenders could respond. The fourth technique involved what modern military analysts would call logistical interdiction, using longships to cut enemy supply lines by controlling river transport. By positioning ships at strategic river junctions, Vikings could essentially strangle the economy of entire regions without ever attacking a major settlement. These advanced techniques had their failures too. The Siege of Paris in 885-886 showed the limitations of longship-based warfare against heavily fortified positions. When the Franks managed to block the Seine with fortified bridges, even Viking ship technology couldn't overcome prepared defenses with unlimited time to react. But the successes were spectacular. The establishment of the Danelaw in England, the conquest of Normandy, the founding of Kiev and other Russian cities. All of these achievements were made possible by longship technology that allowed Vikings to project military power across distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. The speed of Viking expansion across Europe becomes comprehensible only when you understand that their ships allowed them to move armies faster than information could travel. A Viking fleet could sail from Denmark to the coast of Spain faster than news of their departure could be carried overland. So here's what we're really looking at. The Vikings didn't just build better ships. They created the world's first global military technology that gave them a strategic advantage lasting 3 centuries. Those longships weren't just vessels, they were the key that unlocked medieval Europe for Scandinavian expansion. While other cultures were focused on building bigger armies and stronger fortifications, Vikings developed mobility and surprise as their primary weapons. The real genius wasn't in any single innovation. It was in how they integrated shallow draft hulls, hybrid propulsion, advanced navigation, and coordinated tactics into a complete military system that no medieval army could counter. Think about the strategic implications. A Viking leader could launch simultaneous raids from Ireland to Constantinople, coordinate attacks across thousands of miles of coastline, and move armies faster than their enemies could communicate. For medieval defenders, it must have felt like fighting an enemy that could teleport. The legacy of Viking naval technology extends far beyond the medieval period. Modern special operations forces use many of the same principles: small, fast, versatile units that can appear anywhere without warning. The US Navy SEALs' emphasis on coming from the sea, striking quickly, and disappearing before the enemy can respond is essentially Viking strategy with modern equipment. Even modern shipbuilding incorporates lessons learned from longship design. The shallow draft vessels used for amphibious warfare, the hybrid propulsion systems on modern naval vessels, and the emphasis on speed and maneuverability over heavy armor all trace their conceptual origins back to those clinker-built ships sliding down Norwegian beaches 1,000 years ago. But perhaps the most important lesson is strategic. The Vikings understood that the most effective weapon isn't always the biggest or most powerful one. Sometimes the most devastating capability is the one that changes the rules of engagement entirely. The most successful Vikings weren't just good at fighting. They were good at appearing where fighting was unexpected, striking before the enemy could prepare, and disappearing before retaliation was possible. They turned the ocean from a barrier into a highway, and in doing so, they changed the course of European history forever.